Hello. 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 Hello and welcome to Caged In. This is another one of our bonus Caged In conversations where I sit down and speak to somebody who has worked with Nicolas Cage. On this episode, I get someone who's not worked with him not once, not twice, but 3 times. I get to speak to editor Brett W. Bachman, who's worked with Nicolas Cage on Mandy, Color Out of Space, and Pig, which is released today, if you're listening to this day of release, in the US, and is released in the UK on the 20th of August. So it is very much in our crosshairs, and it's a fantastic film. It's not like it's up there, not only being my favourite Nicolas Cage film of the year, possibly my favourite film of the year. It's a beautiful, poetic film that has this fantastic, fascinating meta-narrative that I'll get into later on down the podcast when I eventually cover this film in all its gory details. But for now, yeah, listen to this conversation with Brett Bachman. It's a amazing conversation. We get into some stuff that I've never heard before in regards to some of these films. Not that any of it's libelous or anything like that. Just, yeah, Brett was amazingly generous with his time and just the stories he told me. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. There's mention of Daniel Noah in this conversation, who you may remember from a previous Caged In conversation. But yeah, if this is your first time listening, do be sure to check out that, because there's a lot of crossover. Daniel is a producer on both Mandy and Color Out of Space, so that may pique your interests. But there's plenty of fantastic Caged In conversations, and I'll talk about a few in the outro. I imagine a lot of you listening to this might already be regular listeners. So yeah, drop in at the end if you want to get some recommendations of other great conversations I've had with some fantastic people. But until then, enjoy this conversation with Brett W. Bachman. One last thing before you enjoy this week's episode. There are some spoilers for Pig, but me and Brett do signpost them before we get into them, so it shouldn't ruin the episode. And this is kind of done in a kind of career chronological order, so it will go Mandy, Color Out of Space, and then Pig. So there's plenty of listen to before you duck out of that part. I totally understand if you want to go into that film as fresh as possible, and I would very much recommend it. So yeah, if you're going to not listen to all of this episode, I totally understand it, but there is plenty to enjoy in the meantime. I have the pleasure of being joined by an editor, producer, actor, and somebody who's possibly looked at Nic Cage's face for more hours than even me. Brett Bachman. How are you, Brett?
Hi, man. I am doing very well. It's such a joy to be here.
How is it, like, kind of, you've got Pig coming out, which I would have talked about in the intro. And I think the first question I kind of want to ask you is, you're like the through line, basically, of what I'm calling like the Niconaissance. Like, if you kind of look at these, like, there's these 3 big Nic Cage movies where it's like the early 2010s, everybody are like, he's fallen off. And then there's these ones that seeing him like claw back into popular favor. And you seem to be involved in all 3 of them. How does that feel?
That's really cool. It's I always do other to express it. It's a combination of being in the right place at the right time, and it's been an absolute pleasure to work with someone like Nic, time and time again. And you never really know what he's going to do.
Yeah.
The amount of precision this guy has. I will say he's never boring to work with. He's never boring to watch, and it's so far it's been the distinction of my career so far. I'm 19 features in, but hoping I can do more with him.
Perfect. Well, before we kind of get into like a Nic Cage rabbit hole too deep, where did you like start off as an editor? Where did you like what made you think this is what I want to do?
Yeah. I had started way back in high school. We have this thing you do your senior year of high school called the senior project, which is, this 20-hour, you have to put 20 hours into this product for this career fair you make. And I thought I was going down a medicine path. I thought I wanted to kind of follow into becoming a doctor, but I was playing high school football at the time. And a friend had me over one day and he showed me this wrestling highlight video that someone had made in his school district. And it had had interviews with the team. It had had these little vignettes. It had had footage throughout the year. And it just kind of had like this the fact that, a 17-year-old had made this 15 to 20-minute thing. And this is, mind you, this is like way back in 2003 when edit cameras and editing equipment like weren't really everywhere. And it got me really excited about the possibility of me doing something like that for the team I was playing on. And I was able to kind of set up this documentary of sorts. And so I got all the appropriate permission from my coach and was able to borrow a video camera and started shooting everything behind the scenes, some practice footage, some just random interactions throughout the spring of my junior year, going into summer camp. During games, I would obtain footage from people up in the stands, from the high school video production squad down in the field. And after months and months of doing this, had tons of footage. We ended up winning league that year for the first time in years and years. And sat down in front of Final Cut Pro 5, which I'd never really used before, and kind of taught myself how to edit on this senior project thing. Long story short, came in every single day at the end of school, edited until like 7 or 8 every single night. And then when the movie was done, had a little mini premiere in the school's auditorium in March. Probably one of the more influential dates of my entire life. Came into school the next day, sat in front of my the EMAC where I'd edited this thing in the video production lab, and just wished I had something else to work on, something else to do. And that was kind of the genesis of it all. From there, I ended up switching what I wanted to do. I went to a little state school called Western Washington University up in Bellingham, Washington. Got really involved in their at a college TV program where I did a lot of sketch comedy. I was writing, I was acting, editing, directing. And after a few years of that, realizing that, yes, this is something I really want to be serious about, made the decision to start looking into film school. I wanted a very specific, traditional kind of academic environment to keep on with this, because Western really wasn't much. They didn't really have much in the way of a practical film program. And so it kind of came down between. That's kind of how I ended up over at AFI. And after spending 2.5 years at the program there, and meeting friends, hopefully after the rest of my life, and having I graduated that and sputtered around Los Angeles for 2 years, kind of doing any single little odd job I could. I was doing music videos. I was doing sketches for Funny or Die. I was doing things on spec. And I eventually got an email one night from a staff member at AFI. And occasionally they'll send out blasts of emails being like, hey, so-and-so looking for an editor, starts tomorrow. And I have my resume ready. I have my website ready. And this email blast comes out saying, low budget action horror movie looking for an editor, starts next week. Sent in my resume, sent in everything, get a phone call the next day saying, "Hey, like your stuff, come over to Burbank, meet us on set, and do an interview."
Amazing.
And that ended up being Raise. That was my first feature.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up meeting a very special person in my life who really opened the door for my entire career. This guy named Josh Waller, who was the director on Raise, to this day, still one of my best friends. And that was the connection that led me into SpectreVision. And that, you know, that I've done 9 films with the partners over SpectreVision now. And it's kind of where everything started for me.
So that relationship you have with SpectreVision is kind of like, when it comes to like pictures like Mandy, how did that come about? Did they kind of go like, we trust you from what you've done with like Cooties and stuff like that? You said in total you've made 9 features with them. How did the Mandy job come about?
Well, I had a really fortunate position with the partners, where we had Mandy was, I think, our 8th film we'd done together.
Mm-hmm.
Ray's Mechanic, Cooties, Max Rose, Camino, Bitch. Yeah, it was like 6 or 7. And so usually I was the first one to get a script from, like, they weren't even really talking to a lot of other editors at that time. It was like Brett is up for this. If Brett passes, we'll go to somebody else.
Yeah.
But also, hey, we need to maintain that this is someone the director wants to work with in the first place. And so, it's not like I just get the job. It's like, we want to put Brett up for this. Let's have Brett meet with the director. Let's sure Brett and the director get along. So that's how, Bitch came about. That's how Cooties came about, meeting with John and Carrie. That's how, every single other relationship with the director I've had that Spectre has done. It's I meet with the director, make sure that we're on the same page about the movie, that the chemistry is there, we're going to get along.
Yeah. What is your kind of ethos as to like what the editor's job is and how it like services the film? Because what I've noticed from watching a lot of your films this week is that you don't like, it's not like a distinct Brett Bachman style, as it were. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. And I think that's how it should be. My ethos, it's just to support the director and to find the best movie with the production team. SpectreVision, in particular, are producers that they have a particular brand. They have a movie they set out to make. That's the reason the company was formed in the first place. They want to put certain movies out into the world, and so they are involved, I think, from a very big creative standpoint, but at the appropriate time. We have our several weeks that the director and I will work together. We present an early cut if we're trying to submit to Sundance or to another festival, get preliminary notes on that, and then eventually the producers are invited in to participate in the editing process. I've always saw myself as there for the director, there to make sure I get on the same page with the director, to make sure that what I am working on is the best movie in their head. And mind you, that sometimes that means challenging the director. Sometimes that means positioning other options. Sometimes that means, playfully being a devil's advocate. Mandy's a good reference where, sometimes I would, question, pitch things to Panos, whether it was scene compression or whether it was alternative options. And sometimes they'd just be like, no, that's not what I want. I want to keep this scene the way it is, or I want to make this scene, longer. It has to have a very particular rhythm. But I want to make sure that I'm welcomed by the director to be there, that I am entrusted with them, that I am working for them, and that I'm also working collaboratively with the producers when they come on board. And so I don't think it's really appropriate for an editor to have a particular style, because every single film requires a different creative beast. It's has different requirements, different genres require different tactics. I just hope I can make the best movie possible with the team, and that comes down to, a lot of it comes down to my early cuts with sensibilities and taste and rhythm, and, working with the material that is given to me by the production. And on some movies, fortunately, that sometimes that aligns really quickly. Like on Color Out of Space, for instance, there's a lot of scenes that appear in the final film, more or less identical to the assembly cut, like more or less identical to the first edit.
So yeah, back to Mandy. How did that project come about? Like, were they like, how does it tend to come about? Is it like the
Yeah.
film's finished and then like they go, "Hey man, you come and edit this," or is it kind of what stage do they get you on
Yeah, yeah,
board?
yeah. I was on set for another movie with them. We were shooting this movie called Bitch,
Mhm.
and I had found out hanging out on set, grabbing footage one night that they had locked in Cage, um,
Amazing.
and it was a big deal. And they were going to go to the press with it pretty soon. And mind you, I don't hear a lot about things in development until they're like greenlit, they're ready to go because Spectre will have any number of things in development at any given time.
Yeah.
But this was a big deal for them. They're like, this is going to be one of the probably the most high profile project we've done. Now that Cage is involved, I was being told about Panos, and then the project kind of went away for a few months. At least from my perspective, I went on to do another movie, um, and it was ended up being really serious. They got greenlit, they had the money, they were going over to Belgium to start location scouting and shooting. And then I heard through them that it would likely have to be a Belgium editor for tax reasons. They had a certain tax requirement that they needed for the rebate to spend a certain amount of money in Europe. And so it looked like this probably wouldn't happen for me,
Mhm.
which sucked because it's everything they had told me from that initial pitch. Nic Cage, surreal love story, barbarian movie set in the 80s sounded like exactly my type of jam. Uh, and then it all kind of once it came together for me, it happened incredibly fast. I was on a commercial shoot on the East Coast. So this one particular morning, I was I had received the script. I had read the script a few weeks previous, just out of curiosity from them. And I was like I said, I was on a commercial shoot in Baltimore. We were on a field shooting an Under Armour commercial with a cross country group, and I was left behind to like guard everybody's personal, like all the bags from like all the high schoolers and like Brett, watch the battery, sit here, don't move. And
This isn't what I
so that's
signed
what
on for.
yeah, so that's what I was doing. And then I get a text, and it's Josh Waller, the head of production inspector, and he was
Mhm.
like out there working with them. And he's like, "Can you Skype with Panos in 5 minutes?"
Whoa.
And I'm in the middle of nowhere in a field in Baltimore, and I have like 3 bars. I'm like 10% on my phone. I was like, "Yes, fuck it, let's do it." And sure enough, like he Skypes me in from his apartment in Belgium, and we just started talking about the movie. Exchanged some pleasantries, talked about uh, what they've been doing over there. They had been shooting for about, I think, 2 or 3 weeks by this point, and my phone dies, like right in the middle of this interview. And fortunately, I had like charged my backup battery the next day, so I run over my backpack, grab my battery pack out, plug it in, wait like 2 minutes, boots back up, call him right back, and we just continue talking about the movie. Um, I remember in particular, it really reminded me a lot of Holy Mountain and El Topo, some
Yeah.
of Jodorowsky's stuff. And one of the things that I think Panos really responded to was how I talked about I love the devolution of the character
Yeah.
of Red as the film progresses. In a way, the entire texture of the movie, the visual style, the sounds, because there's a lot of also sound stuff written into the script as well, how all that kind of evolves and changes and as Red steadily becomes less and less human the
Mhm.
more he gets closer to this goal of committing the ultimate revenge. And Panos really responded well to that. He was like, if you can come out to set to, do a pleasantry and meet and greet, you're on board.
Amazing.
And this has to be the absolute biggest coincidence in my entire life because on this commercial shoot, it was a traveling shoot. We'd been in Baltimore, had just been in Washington D.C., and I shit you not, in 3 days we were flying out to Berlin, and like I'd never been to Berlin before my entire life up until this point. They're like, yes, if you can fly out to meet us, by the end of the week you got the job, and like, well, funny you should say that. So I landed in Berlin, hopped the plane over to Brussels, met everybody, exchanged pleasantries, and they gave me a shuttle drive, and that was that. And I started.
Amazing. So, like, w- in regards to Panos and Mandy, like with the pacing of that film, how like kind of important was that? Because it's got this like I always look at it, it's this film of like two perfect halves, and it's kind of like you've got that beautiful centerpiece, which is
Yeah.
the scene. And I'm sure if I say that, everybody knows exactly the scene I'm talking about in regards to Mandy. But like, how important was it to Panos about like the kind of the pacing and that kind of like the kind of broken up into like the title
Yeah.
cards and that? How early was that in? Was that in the script, or is that did that come later?
Yeah. Yeah. Also the pacing, uh, extremely important.
Hmm.
That Panos is a type of filmmaker that has the way a film moves,
Hmm.
the rhythm of a movie is just as important as who is cast
Yeah.
to him. Like he has a very particular, he's attuned to a very particular frequency with the rhythm of the movie. And so more often than not, when I would show him an assembly of the scene, he'd be like, I have like two notes and it needs to be 20% longer. Like I want these lulls. I want these super slow transitions. The way this rhythmically, the heartbeat of this movie is so important and so crucial to the way he looks at things.
Mhm.
And so that was in the film's DNA from the get-go. Like it's as important to him as, Johann's score. Like
Yeah.
it is everything to him. And we got to a point where, this first edit of the movie, I think was 2:45, maybe close to 3 hours.
Wow.
Um, and we definitely lost some scenes to get it down in time. But I mean, there was a cut of the movie that Panis was ready to lock at 2 hours and 15 minutes. And this was like when we were in Brussels in the last few weeks of the edit. He was like, I would like to walk right now. And the producers and the team are like, please, like, let us show you a cut that's at 2 hours at least.
Yeah, yeah.
And that ended up more or less kind of being the cut that exists today. But so it's extremely important to him. And that being said, the two halves that you speak of were always that way.
Yeah.
He always had a very particular way that he wanted us to see Mandy. He talked to me a lot about how much more he associated and related to Mandy than Red. Like he always found Mandy much more of an interesting character. And when Red does become your protagonist in the second half, according to Panos, he's just an extension of Mandy at that point. Like he always found them kind of as like this singular character almost. In terms of the title cards, that Mandy card in the middle was always where it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
Or not exactly. It used to happen like right after. I think we had tried a few different edits where we had moved it around a little bit. I think initially in like the script, it was written into the script before he goes to Carruthers, before he makes the beast, before he makes the axe. And then when we got to that, we're like, well, if we put it, after he visits Carruthers, where the momentum's warming up, we're learning about the Black Skulls, we're learning about the adversaries, and then we put it right after the axe being made, and you put it right before he's driving down the road in his pickup, like the momentum and the surge of energy that's going to build is going to be huge. So that's ultimately where we ended up putting it. But the other two cards, Children of the New Dawn card was written in to the script as well.
Yeah.
And then I think it was, I can't remember whose idea it was. It might have been mine. Two chapter cards felt like it was incomplete, like at least to me. I felt like we needed a third one. And so then we kind of conceived this idea of having three chapters of the movie, essentially. So, there's a lot of, press out there and people say it has two chapters. I always envision this having three. You have the Shadow Mountains, your first chapter of the movie. You have Children of the New Dawn, when you meet the cult and you get the sense of adversary into their lives. And then, when it becomes Red's story, the Mandy title card.
What I find really fascinating about Mandy is that kind of like there's like this weird blurring between what is like like almost like visual effects and what is editing. Like I guess a scene that really sticks out to me is that scene where Jeremiah and Mandy's faces meld together. Is that like is that a visual effect, or is that like kind of editing trickery?
It's a little bit of both. It starts out as editing trickery.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of embellishments that have been done to that particular scene, which so that face melting shot in particular, they shot that to be designed where it would
Yeah.
kind of meld and flesh back and forth. And we had an early version of that where you apply these really long cross dissolves just to kind of see that it's working. You work the timing out, and you get uh, the shots and the faces where you want them to be. And then eventually we kicked that off to our visual effects team, who really like tracked Andrea's face and her pupils in particular, so they would match up perfectly with Linus's. But there's a lot of other stuff in that scene, which is editing trickery. For instance, I think every single shot in that sequence is at 95% speed or 90% speed. I can't remember which one in particular. But we slowed every single shot down later in post, and then those the movement trails, those blue elements that are left behind when people move, that is something that Panos conceived, and we ended up doing in the last few weeks of the edit.
Amazing. So I guess we need to speak about the scene, right? The kind of what I call like the earned Nic Cage freak out in the bathroom, that kind of like explosion of grief. And it's like I think Panos has spoke about it, that there's that scene's got a mistake in it, right? Like there's kind of can you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah. So the mistake to speak of, so we have two takes of this. I think I was going to go with the first take. Panos and Waller told me I was crazy. It has to be take two. And that's the film that's the reason I was like, well, take two has an error in it. And mind you, I was also never mind. So take two, there is an instance where he's going into his vodka stash. He pulls out the bottle and he's throwing things around out of this drawer. And he throws a towel that lands on the dolly track. Nobody noticed because you have Nic Cage screaming his heart out and giving this performance that no one clocks this thing. And so when he sits on the toilet and begins to break down, or the performance becomes much more inside and much more interior, the camera pushes forward and hits that towel that's on the dolly rack. And so if you are familiar with the film, you'll notice that the camera really isn't sure what to do at that moment. And that's because we can't fucking move any closer because there's a... So what they were doing was pulling the dolly back in the middle of the take. Someone rushed in, grabbed this towel off the dolly, and they continued the take and pushed back in. But Panos is that kind of director who's like, I don't give a fuck. Like it's wonderful. Like it's
it adds to the kind of like the anger and the kind of like, do you know what I mean, the franticness of Red at that moment. So like it's those beautiful mistakes that kind of make that. And I imagine like it would take a lot out of an actor to kind of give that. Like I'd imagine Cage wouldn't be doing 5-6 takes of that anyway, right?
No, typically not. On Mandy in particular, it's a bit different for Color and Pig, but for Mandy in particular, it was really rare if we did above 3 takes for Nic. He was just, it was a combination of, technically the Belgium crew was amazing. Very little resets needed for any kind of thing like that. But, Panos had a really good indication of what he wanted on the day. Him and Nic were aligned quite well in terms of what was going to happen. And so, usually they would get it in 1 or 2 takes and move on. And same with Andrea for that matter too. To this day, it's probably the film I have the least amount of coverage for that I've ever done. And that just, I think, goes to show, when you know what you want, and it is, because they had a respectable budget, they could have kept on shooting, but they know exactly what they want. And Panos is also that director who, relishes in things being a bit gritty. He loves things being a bit dirty. I remember during the edit, he would talk about how one of the reasons he doesn't really like a lot of studio films is because they feel too polished, they feel too inauthentic, they feel too artificial, and there's no sense of a human element to it.
Yeah. Well, there's a beautiful like grit and a grain to Mandy that kind of like it almost feels like a film that like was made in the 80s somewhat, that like it's kind of like just been like the dust has been blown off and like you've like someone's unearthed, do you know what I mean? Like found it in the back of a video store and gone like, oh, how come nobody's ever talked about this? And it's like, I don't know, it's like a fascinating artifact of like, and yeah, like feels
He,
otherworldly as well.
he would be so happy to hear you say that. That's
I don't know who said it. Somebody said like an amazing thing once that like it feels like a movie that's about like the roadies of like a metal band. When you see those metal bands who have like that kind of, I don't know, like fantasy imagery on the side of their
mhm,
like tour vans. Like Red is almost like one of those roadies who works on like is in that kind of metal world, and it's
yeah.
yeah.
It's the movie is such an interesting combination of Panos' influences and things he saw when he was a kid. I mean, from I remember him talking a lot about, going, of course, going into video rental places and seeing the horror art on movies he wasn't allowed to rent.
Yeah.
I remember there's another story he tells where he was in Mexico, and he saw this Mexican biker pull up and just like do donuts in his front yard, and how like this clad image of this guy in leather, just most punk thing you can imagine, and driving away really ingrained with him. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's all a very interesting combination, and of course, you talk about Children of the New Dawn, and it's totally influenced by 80s doom metal. I mean,
Yeah.
we tempt a lot of the movie with some really dark stuff, and then there's also a big love. Like we used a lot of Brian May from Queen. We used a lot of Flash Gordon in that temp. We used a fair amount of Van Halen as well. Some of the instrumental stuff. So it's a very interesting mixture of all these different influences for this time and place in the world. And I don't know if I'll have the joy of working on something that eclectic and diverse and rich in terms of like its influences ever again. By barbarian movies as well. Like he talks about Conan a lot, during the editing process of this film. But it's a film that proudly wears its influences on its sleeve, whether
Yeah.
it's classic 80s animation, or whether it's Jodorowsky, or whether it is
There's something that always stands out to me there, and I'm not sure if it's like from Panos or it's just a coincidence, but there seems to be like a Phantasm 2 like reference in it, like even the way that like Red is dressed like in the kind of utility vest like type thing, and like especially the chainsaw fight, 'cause I think like if I remember rightly, like character Reggie ends up like with a chainsaw at the end of Phantasm 2. So like
yeah.
Don Coscarelli, and it very much fits that kind of 80s movie store aesthetic. Like it's one
Oh
of those
man,
kind of odd films.
Phantasm,
Yeah.
Hellraiser. There's a Friday the 13th reference in there. I mean,
Mhm.
this is all Panos's teenage years
Ha-
coming out. Kind of a petri dish of all of his influences coming together. That's all of that stuff is in there.
So in regards to like the films you work on, how often do directors tend to like you always hear these stories that they say to like actors and stuff like that, like here's like a list of movies to kind of check out. This is, do you know what I mean? Like this is what the vibe
Mhm.
I'm going for, whatever. Do you ever get like a kind of anything like that, or are you kind of I don't want to know about like what's kind of influenced you, kind of?
Sometimes I usually I ask first and foremost just to if they have any particular influences they want me to take a look at. I did a movie just recently called Werewolves Within,
Mhm.
where the director really wanted to kind of capture this particular tone that you could kind of attribute or call a mix of a great but classic Amblin, but also some like early Coen brothers as well.
Mhm.
The eclectic rich of like all these different influences. Whether it comes down to a lot of the tempo and the camera trickery of Edgar Wright movies, like Hot Fuzz in particular, or whether it kind of has a lot of this charm and Ernst quality of like an Amblin movie, or if it has kind of the quirk and the eclecticness and kind of the character oddities that a Coen brothers might have, or that are well known for, particularly like Raised in Arizona or some of the earlier movies. And so for that movie, that was a film that he's like, yeah, check out these films. And I watched a lot of those movies, getting to work on that movie, to get an idea for his taste, to get an idea of the sensibilities. What's the tone, what's the vibe, what's the rhythm you're going for. Um, uh, Other films, not so much. Pig in particular was a movie that Michael had, I think, one or two references he wanted me to look at. But that's a movie when you saw the footage, you were very aware of what it was.
Mm-hmm.
And same with Mandy. Like Mandy was one of those things where I think it was my first day, and I think the first scene I ever worked on was actually a scene that got cut from the film. But it was really clear, at least to me early on, what this was. This was something I could like tap into all that scary shit I saw on cable TV in my teenage years. That was like these old scuzzy 1970s, early 1980s movies that felt gritty, and just the texture of them felt so raw.
Mm-hmm.
And just the way it looked kind of frightened you a little bit. Whether it was the fog and the darkness and the wetness and the grain, it just felt destroyed. And mix that with the performances and mix that with Cage's performance and the script, which was very evocative and very, very confident in what it was, to a point where like, you could read it and be like, this makes no sense. Like, but, fortunately, like I read it and I was like, I know exactly what this is, or I think I know exactly what this is. Yeah.
I could, I'm going to move on from Mandy. Don't worry, Brett. But there's obviously one thing like I feel like I have to mention, which is the Johan Johansson score. And when did that, like, for you, like, what did you get to, were you privy to like any of the score whilst you're editing, or did it come after you'd kind of submitted your edit?
No, Johan was one of the first crew members that was hired on the movie.
Amazing.
Like I think after it was well before even me. Waller had worked with him on Mechanic right before Johan had come out with Prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And so he already had that connection before Johan essentially kind of blew up. But Johan had reached out to Spectre when he found out about Mandy and Color Out of Space in particular. Like Johan really wanted to do Color back when the two of these projects have been announced. And I think, hopefully I'm right about this, but he was slated to like be the composer for Color as well. Hopefully I'm correct about that. I don't want the press coming or Spectre coming at me about that. So when I had started the director's cut with Panos up in Vancouver, Johan started out by saying there's 3 demos. One demo doesn't appear in the movie at all. It took a much more kind of Queen Brian May approach with it. One demo ended up kind of becoming the template for a motif that would occur later in the movie. I think if you're familiar with the soundtrack, it was called Dive Bomb Blues, or that was the eventual name of it. And then another piece he recorded went into the movie as is. Panos and I were like, this is perfect. And it was the piece of music that plays when Mandy finds the dead deer.
Yeah.
I think that has been maybe changed subtly since that first demo, but otherwise, we threw that in the scene, we looked at it together, and I think Panos and I both made like kind of a mutual decision, like, don't touch it. It's perfect. Like everything about this is the movie. And so from that point moving forward, like throughout the rest of the weeks of the director's cut in Vancouver to the point where we started doing the producer's cut over in Belgium, Johan wanted to say this stuff almost on a daily basis. We were a small movie, so we didn't really have a music editor kind of going in tandem. Usually you'd have a music editor kind of digesting this material, working with the stems, putting something in the picture, but that was all me. And so there's a good wealth of material that Johan recorded that never made it into the movie that, was like awesome and incredible, but I'm hoping will be released one day because he wrote so much for this movie that the public has not heard, it's not aware of. Panos, the typical day would be Panos and I listening to these demos, and Johan would write some of the stuff sometimes without any clear indication of where it was going to go. And so it kind of came down to Panos and I being like, where do we put in this track? Where do we put in this? Let's put it up against picture here. One of the ones in particular that comes to mind is this big 80s gated drum track that eventually became the music when Red's driving from the chemist up until the children's children's range. That I think that was initially written without a clear indication of where it was going to go. And it's only kind of in hindsight, I look at it right now and I realize like how special that was and how unique and beautiful these tracks were, because you're in post on a movie every single day. It's 12 hours of stuff and notes and revisions and music. Okay, cool. Let's try it, throw it in. And not only in hindsight, you're like, that one of the better movie scores I've ever heard in my entire life.
Yeah.
And I wish I had more of an opportunity, to really appreciate that when you're working on this. And then
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a soundtrack I listen to, and hopefully, like you say, we get to hear that kind of those other tracks, even if it's in that 2 hours 15 cut that Panos met one day might get his way in release. So let's talk about Color Out of Space. Were you brought on earlier to that, or was it a similar situation?
I had heard about Color because they had announced their collaboration with Richard on that years before. I mean, this was even before I think they'd announced Mandy. So it was certainly on my radar. I'd expressed, I think, interest to either Daniel or Lisa or like someone there. I'd expressed interest about it, and they're like, "Yeah, don't worry about it. You'll be fine." And we were in post on Daniel Isn't Real when I found out that Color was indeed greenlit. And I think Daniel asked me as he was leaving the edit one day, he's like, "You're doing Color, right?" And I'm like, I wasn't even aware you're doing Color. Like that's a go. And he's like, "Oh yeah, we'll set up a meeting with Richard. It'll be great." And I think 2 weeks later, I was talking with Richard on Skype, and kind of the same thing with Mandy. Just talked about how the script, what it reminded me of, my personal connection to it, how I felt about it. I think we ended up talking a lot. Richard and I ended up talking a lot about the creature itself, the color, the entire the alienness of it. What does something sound like when it doesn't have vocal cords? How does it move? What is something? How do you do the story right? It's supposed to be something that doesn't exist on the color spectrum. Humans aren't supposed to see it. How do you make that into something that is a visual medium, a visual and a sonic medium? Like, how do you pay that its due? And so I had a little bit of a hiatus in between Daniel Isn't Real, where I ended up doing Vigil, and then I jumped right on the Color after that and went over to Portugal to shoot it.
So how was that experience in Portugal? I know that Daniel Noah said to me like Sintra just seems to be this kind of magical place. He said like even I think there's a shot of a ring around the moon, and he's like that's not a VFX, like that is real, like that's the kind of the mysticism and magic that's in the air in that place.
I wish more people knew that Color Out of Space was shot in Sintra, because you should go. It is one of my favorite places I've ever been. And it was such a nice experience shooting there and being there for the duration of that. We were set up in for the unaware. Sintra is a very old town. Just outside of Lisbon, about half an hour. It's kind of up in the hills, this little small mountain area. So it's very moist. It feels very much like New England or even the Pacific Northwest, because it has a lot of fog, has a lot of trees, big forests, and there's a lot of estates. There's a lot of old houses there from the Portuguese royalty and the aristocrats and it's well known now for being the source of the home of many palaces, in addition to a Turkish castle, I think, on top of a hill. And the typical day would be, us getting into one of the production vans inside of Sintra at this beautiful little hotel, driving up these very wavy zigzag streets up the mountain, getting out, and the main Gardner house where we shot the majority of the movie is all one location. I think there were only maybe 3 or 4 other major locations that we ended up using, but almost everything was like shot in this one spot. But base camp was set up in a building right next to the barn. So if you're familiar with Color, if you know kind of the rough geography of the Gardner house on a hill, the well, and then the barn where the alpacas are, base camp was in a giant house literally just right to the barn. So like if the camera was to like pivot and turn just like 15 degrees to the right, you see this big yellow structure, which is where we had our production offices, where we had our meals, where I was based. So I would show up, have a quick breakfast, go upstairs into this old mansion, I think built probably in the late 1700s, 1800s, definitely had that vibe, and begin working on the previous day with my assistant. Um, Sometimes they would be shooting in the barn directly below us. I remember in particular the day where Cage comes in and shoots the alpacas.
Mm-hmm.
We have to do 20 takes of that, three different angles, a close up, some inserts, so a wide, over shoulders. And so every 5 or 10 minutes I would hear that dependable Cage scream just downstairs as I was editing, because he's only he's literally only like 20 feet away from you as they're shooting this, and so you're trying to be quiet, and then of course you hear bang, ah, bang, ah. You're like, yeah, just keep on working, this will happen for another 2 hours. And what was a really good thing about this is that I could just throw a rough cut onto my phone, and then go out to visit set and like show something to the producers, or show something to, more often than not, show something to Richard.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember the day, like one of the days in particular, I was working on the finger chop scene, and I had come up with the idea to or the news to play a joke on Nathan. So I came up with this idea that, like, as he's talking about, oh yeah, I appreciate a nice bourbon out of Texas. I came up with this idea to put like bourbon connoisseur at the bottom of the Chiron. I was
Amazing.
like, I'm so happy with this, so proud of this. And I took it down, and Richard and Waller were hanging out, and I showed them the scene like on my phone, and Richard's like, perfect, great, love it.
So what was the vibe like on set? 'Cause I know that Cage has said that he was kind of channeling his dad, like in regards to that film. Like, was he very like taken away? Like, was he like kind of kept himself to himself, or was he mingling with all of you, having those meals around that table?
I mean, Cage is the kind of guy that he's a consummate
Mm-hmm.
professional. I mean,
Yeah.
he will show up, he will clock in. He's the most, out of all the actors I've worked with, I've done 19 features now. He's the most gifted actor I've worked with. Like, he's the way he can hit his marks, the technical precision of this guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's the kind of guy, if you tell him not to blink for a minute,
Yeah.
it's super easy for him just not to stare ahead, not move, not blink. Never forgets a line, never misses his mark. And yet you're still super excited to see what he's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Never boring to watch. And so I don't really socialize with Nic, during the production process of a movie. He has his thing going, I have my thing going. And so he will, and there are some times where he won't even socialize with the other actors. I mean, there's, when he was doing Mandy in particular, I'm not to go back to that movie, but like when him and Linus had scenes together, they would not interact at all. Like, to kind of keep that relationship cold and like save it all for the camera. So on color, he was, I think, a bit more social with the other actors.
Yeah.
I think Madeline and Brendan in particular. But he would show up. He would work. He would go back to his trailer for lunch. He would clock out, go back to the hotel, and then day and day and day again. Yes, he was that voice, the affectation he does, the mutation that this alien organism does when it gets into you affects everybody else a little bit differently. And Cage had come up with this idea in tandem with Richard to have him devolve a little bit into his father, into this kind of arty narcissist, judgmental type. And so that, almost that voice, which a lot of people have incorrectly attributed to Trump, it's actually his dad. It's him falling into his real life dad, this voice that I used to hear, this judgmental voice that, you're not going to be good enough, Nathan. You're not going to be, etc. And he takes that on the more his character begins to devolve. It's a very specific choice he made as an actor with Richard. And we work on crafting that. There's a lot more of that in the dailies. There were some even freakouts that didn't make it into the movie. There are some lines we lost here or there because you're crafting this performance. And Cage, being the actor that he is, he's always going to give you stuff that is surprising and stuff that is different. He's completely unafraid. And when you have a director like Richard who is willing to let Cage try a lot of stuff out, sometimes he goes really far.
Yeah.
I think, did Daniel talk to you about the nose clip or like the
Yeah,
hairpin on the nose.
yeah. He
Yeah,
said, he wanted the nose clip, and Daniel came up with, like, gave me the best analogy I think I've ever heard for kind of Cage's style of acting. He's like a garden hose that's like spraying water, and if he's with a right director, they know how to hold that hose and water their garden perfectly. Get those
exactly.
nice ripe tomatoes, or if the director's not up to it, they kind of just let that hose go wild, and Cage will run with
That's
it.
a perfect analogy. Like that's great.
Yeah,
And so there's a little bit of the directing that Garth knows, then, so to speak.
yeah,
A lot of that's on set. I think out of like my three films of Cage, I think he explored more stuff in color in terms of like his range of performance than Mandy and Pig. Um, and Richard would then calibrate that performance then on set, but then of course we get into the edit, and there's further calibration that we do.
mhm,
And so a lot of although it makes sense, in the context of that scene, why Nathan would be evolving and going through these tandems. One of the things we kind of found in the context of that, you watch the scene, you edit the scene, you look at the dailies, you assemble it, you think this is great, and then you look at that scene in context, and you're like, well, this just doesn't, this heightened performance, or the how heightened the performance is right now, just doesn't feel in rhythmic tone
mhm.
with the rest of its surrounding scenes. I think we should take them down a little bit, or this particular freak out, let's really pull this back and save it for 10 minutes later when the freak out is a bit more justified.
Yeah,
So for instance, when he is looking at the tomatoes, and the tomatoes are all tasteless, and he's like throwing them around, we have a lot more stuff of that. There's just a lot more stuff of him freaking out, but like, what? He freaks out the appropriate amount here. It's strange. His Jolie, the actress working against him
yeah,
in that scene, is reacting in an appropriate way contextually, but we have to make it fit, the other two scenes to make it feel like it's earned. But also, so, 4 scenes later, after the organism has merged his wife and his son, that he freaks out in the car, that's a really justified freak out.
yeah,
In the same way where you have the vodka scene in Mandy, these things need to fit the story. They need to fit this anger, this burst of energy needs to fit the moment. It has to fit the character at this particular time. And sometimes that means refining and changing a little bit, and kind of a give and take. And it's a little bit of kind of a secret relationship that the editor and we have with the actor. We may never interact on set, but every single thing an actor does, an editor has looked at, they've touched, they've adjusted, they have manipulated. And if we do our job right, you won't even know.
yeah. So one of the people I spoke to on this podcast about Karat Space is Dan Martin, who did the effects on
Oh,
this
cool.
film, like the creature design and stuff like that. So what was it like kind of editing together those scenes? Especially, I think one of the most frightening scenes in this film is um, when Nathan is trying to shove his daughter into the attic with the kind of mother son mutant hybrid, like, because obviously that's a practical effect, right? That's a somewhat puppet and like somebody in a suit.
Yeah. Yeah. It's grotesque in a word. Like, he did a phenomenal job on that movie, to a point where, I would have to kind of take breaks looking at dailies sometimes, because I would feel a bit sickened. And mind you, that's also, Jolie Richardson, of course, who's the actress underneath all this makeup, and
Yeah.
also Julian Hillard, also, pinned to her as well in some
Mhm.
of these scenes, moaning and crying. And you can only look at that for so many
Yeah, yeah.
hours. An audience member is only looking at that for an hour 50 or however long the movie is. But, I would be looking at it for 10 hours a day sometimes. And you're like, I have to take a break from this. Because, they would just, some of these scenes require 10, 15, 20 takes, and they're doing it, they're bringing it every single take. And in conjunction with the Dan's work on the prosthetics, like, it's this, it, everything kind of has to sing together, and everything has to work, and everything has to kind of vibe. And so, a scene like, when Lavinia is thrown into the attic and Nathan
Mhm.
slams the door, and you have, this creature running at you, you have to also kind of put your imagination cap on,
Yeah,
because this puppet running at you also has, like, 4 or 5 guys on green poles, guiding this thing around.
yeah, yeah.
and you have to kind of have that vision of like, what is this thing really going to look like when you remove a lot of the puppetry, and what is that? You have to kind of envision that. And it even kind of came to a point in the edit where like Richard wasn't so sure on some of this stuff that I had included. I mean, there's one particular moment where at the very end of the movie, where they bust in and uh, our monster has like had completed the evolution.
Yeah.
And there's a moment that kind of where Ward busts in, the sheriff busts in, and Jolie lifts her head and screams. And Richard was convinced that was never going to work. He was like, I just see the actor, I see the makeup, I see the effects. And that was like one of the times on the movie that I politely put my foot down as like hard as I could. And I was like, Richard, I will take it out if you really want, but like this will fucking like this will destroy. Like this is going to be so terrifying. With the right sound effect, with the visual effect is done, please let us like move forward with like this is a shot, because I think you're like this will blow your fucking socks off. And so it came up a few times where it's like, I'm not so sure about the shot. And I'm like, please, please. And we got to a point where we had agreed to like make it a visual effect shot, let's include it, let's send it off. And sure enough, we got it back. And I was very fortunate that I was proven right. A lot of times I'm not. Very often I am wrong in the editing process. At one point, I even propositioned cutting the Cheddar Goblin from Mandy, which I was very thankfully in hindsight overruled. And I look back on it now, I'm like, why are you saying this in public? People will never hire you if you say you propose cutting Cheddar Goblin.
Oh yeah, that's got to be a big revenue stream for Legion M, right?
Oh my God, the way that character is taken off. But back to color. I mean, you're looking at these, prosthetics, but as cool as they are, you're looking at the actor underneath the prosthetics. Yeah. And I think the thing that my favorite thing about the work that was done is that you never lose sight of the actor's performance underneath. The Jolie and Julian are their full performance is allowed to breathe and come forward, even when they're wearing, they're caked on all this latex and makeup. And I think they did a phenomenal job with that.
So in regards to something like color that's got a lot of I guess a lot of like visual effects, especially when we get to that like final act and there's all that kind of crazy stuff that the human mind can't comprehend that we see and stuff like that. Is it like an element of like that stuff is happening like nice and early on, so like when it comes to it you can edit it? Like how do you kind of, or just wait till you get that like I don't know, hard drive dumped on you and you're like, well, let's edit this together in the rest of the film?
Yeah, it that changes on a case to case basis with movies. Bigger budget movies. I may just be editing. I may just be working with the material I'm given, and sometimes these are conversations above my pay grade, and I just kind of work with what I'm given. This visual effects already in the pipeline. I prepared this stuff. Color was a different situation though, where we certainly had our visual effectist, we had a visual effects supervisor on set, but it became evident that we weren't going far enough in the edit with the amount of stuff, the amount of surrealism, the amount that the alien changes the fabric of your reality wasn't happening enough. And so one of the things we started doing in the director's cut was augmenting the environment more. So the foliage changing to magenta, for instance, was something that we came up with in the edit. That was something that I'd seen in I was going over some of the lookbooks, I was going over some early artwork, and it had been referenced, but like no one had ever told me on set, hey, this is something we're going to do. Maybe it had been the intent to plan for it, but like if it had, it had never been like relegated to editorial. And so I started trying out all these secondary color correction options in the Avid to like generally gradually shift this thing more into the magenta space to get a sense that this thing is a contaminated environment. You have your sonic elements, you have this high frequency sound that's appearing at times to kind of suggest this thing is around you. But the gradual color change is something that we began to toy with and have temp versions of. The freak out at the end, like the house imploding and like the waves when you move a hand and you have that trail of motion that kind of sticks behind, the flashing lights, the camera shake. That was all stuff that I came up with, something that I pitched to Richard, something that Richard then was like, yeah, let's roll with it. Um, because Richard had never done a film with a lot of visual effects before.
Yeah.
And so this was kind of new territory for him where, he, I think, was just becoming aware of the powers that we kind of had at our disposal.
Mm-hmm.
And mind you, on other films, adding new visual effects may be a no-go, with the studio or the producers. But like, I think Spectre and Richard both agreed this is something that needed to happen. And we ended up adding a lot of visual effects to kind of get across that sense of degradation, that alien, coming into this environment. And so a lot of that was stuff that I ended up doing temp visual effects for, spitting out a shot under After Effects, doing a very rudimentary version, and then having that live in the Avid for a few weeks, until it eventually went over to our visual effect vendors. And then the conversation becomes, okay, look at this very silly and rudimentary white blob that's moving from like screen left to screen right. That's the timing we want to have. This is a kind of a keyframe for how fast this thing moves. Notice how one of the things that came up a lot with our really experienced visual effect team was how often we wanted errors, how often we wanted imperfections in the image, which I think they were maybe a bit surprised at first to hear about, because you spend all this money on a visual effects shot. And they're like, well, why wouldn't you want to see the alien? And then the argument becomes, well, because this is supposed to be an organism that should not exist. This thing is so powerful. This thing is so alien that you should be able to register it. So like, I remember in particular the actual merging scene where Benny and Julian, or Brendan and Julian, run out of the barn. Jolie picks up Julian, and then the color overtakes both of them, and they merge. We had early iterations of that where it's just a magenta light.
Yeah.
And we had had a storyboard where there was going to be a bit more, and we gradually kind of built up the energy, but it's like, this still isn't visceral. It should be horrifying and scary. And it never really worked until we got to a point where when this thing overtakes them, it's just blinding strobe light. It's you can't, like, we overexpose Jolie. We have all this energy, these flashing tendrils. And so it took a little bit of time, but when we got the visual effects team to see like, this thing should be so bright, so overpowering that it blows out the camera, that it shakes the camera. Like, you have to pretend this thing is a real object. If you were shooting it practically, that it would be like being next to a fusion reactor, or it'd be like being next to a bomb going off.
Yeah.
Like, it has to distort the image. It has to, like, you have to lean into those imperfections to make this thing feel real. And once we kind of nailed that in the edit from a temp visual effects standpoint, getting those boards right, that influenced everything we did later on.
Amazing. So again, this is a film that has another fantastic score by Colin Stetson. When did that like come to you? Again, was that a similar thing? Like, it came in the edit, or was it kind of you submitted your edit and then Colin kind of scored to that?
We this was a bit of an unusual not necessarily unusual for this was different from Mandy, I should say, where a lot of times Colin was brought on later in the process. But sometimes what we do is we will spit out scenes or small moments to a composer, and sometimes composers will bid on a movie by sending you back demos. On Cooties, for instance, we were in talks with a few different composers before Crane came aboard, and one of the things that affected that decision were watching demos of early scenes with a score behind them. So with Call Out of Space, for instance, I think Colin, he had known about this movie. He really wanted it. He started writing music, I think, before we even formally engaged with him. And so he was petitioning really hard for this job. And we had received demos from him that were honestly very similar to the final score. He had a lot of these ideas to merge sound design and score, where the identity of this color, the motif of the color, would be almost like this coral reef, like these really high frequency static-like particle sounds, which are actually it's a coral reef, in conjunction with a lot of other avant-garde elements in the score. Like he has elk calls in there, he has cranes, there's a lot of animal elements in this. And so it really came down to him and another artist then Daniel and I would be in the edit, and looking at some of these things, and it kind of became down to which person is going to be. And the team eventually landed on Colin because we brought in his music. We put it up against the very end of the movie. That scene where Ward is up against the dam and he's looking out and he's giving that, the famous H.P. Lovecraft, final words of the short story. And we put up Colin's score against that, like an early iteration of that scene. And that's eventually what we ended up. That was kind of the clincher. That was the decision.
Yeah, it's just, again, it's another perfect marriage, and Colin's music's beautiful. I remember, I think I first heard about Colin from, of all places, Bad Not Good. I think he features on their 4th album or something like that. Obviously a saxophonist. So let's talk about a project that day of release is released today, well, at least in the US, and it is Michael Sarnowski's Pig.
I'm looking for a truffle pig. Someone's store.
What are you thinking?
I remember every meal, every person. You live your life for them, and they don't even see you. We don't get a lot of things to really care about. Who has my pig?
So it's probably a good thing that I played the trailer just then, because it's kind of a question I've had in the back of my mind is, obviously when you edit a film, I guess the trailer then is edited by like a marketing team at like the distribution company. So how does it feel for you as an editor? Like, do you ever feel like when you see, like, whether it's your film or other films, you're like, oh, that's not how I would have done it? Like, take Pig, for instance. When you saw the trailer, do you think it kind of sets up the film that Pig very much is?
That's a great question. There are oftentimes I see early trailers that I despise, that I think don't capture the tone of the movie at all. We had an early version of a trailer for Mandy when we were going to AFM that I think didn't capture the tone of the movie at all. It kind of leaned in and made it seem very silly and didn't capture the tone of it. Pig, we had also seen a version of a trailer for I think AFM or a sales market that made it seem quite silly. And the creative team and I were like, this doesn't seem appropriate for this movie. And Michael, the director, even, drafted up a very politely worded memo and was like, we want something that leans away from the genre tropes because the audience is going to be assuming this is going to be John Wick with a pig. Like the on the page, the type of movies, a lot of movies that Nic puts out these days, are going to put an audience in a position where they're going to assume it's a knockoff. And, it's on paper, it's a silly premise. It's a guy going into the city to rescue his truffle pig. Sounds silly. But the film is not silly. It's not a silly movie. It is, I think, far more grounded than both Mandy and Color. It is, it's a drama, which is, I think, going to be a huge surprise to a lot of people. There are, I think, some surreal elements in there. There's some weirdness. But I would never describe this film as a genre film to an audience, which is why, like, I get a big chuckle when I see, like genre size, like Bloody Disgusting, like, putting out a thing for it. And I'm like, this has far more in common with like an A24 drama or a Neon drama than Dread Central or one of these things. Like, there's maybe one or two moments of, like, fright in this, but like there's almost no blood in this movie. There's nothing that I would quantify this as an action movie at all. And so it's been when you see early trailers sometimes that try and sell a movie like that, it's a bit disheartening because you're like, one of the things that makes this film special is Cage's involvement. And also that this is a very different film than a lot of films he's been putting out recently. It very much stands apart from like a lot of this other stuff. And I think audiences are really curious to see a movie like that with Nicolas Cage showing everything he can do. Because this is, I think, a far different performance than people are expecting him to give. This is not a Nic Cage freak out movie. This is not a Nic Cage meme movie. This is him tapping into something that I don't think people have seen since Joe, or
Yeah.
tapping into even something earlier than that. Like, this is, I didn't really know what to expect from him when I got my first day of dailies, but I was extremely gratified and happy to see the decision that him and Michael chose with the character, because it makes perfect sense. And without giving in the spoilers, like the way where he goes with it, it gives you this entire cathartic emotional ride.
Yeah, so I believe I heard in another interview, you were raised in rural Washington, right? Like, kind of.
Yes, I was. Yeah.
So was this film somewhat for you like going home? Do you know what I mean? Like coming home, because obviously this is set in Portland,
Yeah.
or Oregon. Like, I'm getting mixed up with, but like, do you know what I mean? Like that kind of rural aspect, just away from a town. Or
No,
something like that.
it does. It feels very similar to where I grew up. And even the film points at the Seattle Portland rivalry at one point.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that reminds me so clearly is just like how dark everything is in the forest. You go out in the Pacific Northwest forest in the fall or the spring, and you get an overcast day. It is so dark and so dreary and wet, and it's dripping with texture. And I think that's one of the really remarkable things about Pat's cinematography in this movie is like how perfectly he captures that. It is the texture of moss and how green and wet everything is. It just felt, very much like a trip home for me, because that's where kind of my backyards.
I count it like, I kind of, when I was watching it today, I checked in at like, I think I looked at the ticker and it was like, we've gone 6 minutes in this film and there hasn't been like a single word spoken. Like, again, like I don't want to give away too much, because obviously it's been released day and date of the film, but again, is this a film where like pacing was very particular from Michael, or is it kind of like to get that tone? Like, it feels like a very reflective film.
Yeah. No, I mean, pacing was extremely important to Michael. Not much to the extent as a director like Panos in particular, but I mean, the first cut of Pig we had was close to 3 hours.
Wow.
Yeah, Pig was a movie that came down a lot in screen time. The first cut was very big. We ended up losing a fair amount of scenes. I would probably say half a dozen scenes, and a lot of scenes have come down significantly in their final length from where they were written. But we got into an interesting scenario where this first cut, Michael would see these transitions, and kind of how I go about the early stage of the director's cut is that we go kind of on a chronological basis in a linear fashion, hitting scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and just allowing the director to work with me, get a sense of the material, put their finger on the pulse of the movie. And Michael's early ideas were to really slow everything down, not completely dissimilar to Panos. And so his first director's cut, like that first director's rough that we had, like 3-4 weeks after he started this cut, was even longer. It was even longer than my assembly. And then we ended up watching that down. We're like, this hour is 3 hours. This movie is 3 hours and 15 minutes. We have to, let's start looking at this thing now, maybe contextually. Let's think about like on a scene, instead of like a scene by scene basis, let's think about like in sequences. So, looking at the first sequence of the movie, basically everything up until Pig is abducted, treating that as, one story thread.
Yeah.
How much of this do we really need? How much can we compress? And when we got to that point, Michael was, eager to try out different tempos, different rhythms, some alternative structural things. We got to a point where I think we were into a week at the first cut. We each other producers, they had proposed doing some small restructuring in the beginning to make it seem like there was like more than one story day occurring. So in the early iteration of the cut, that just starts off with Cage and Pig going into the woods, finding the truffle, Amir coming, and then they make a truffle and they go to bed. One of the first things we did when the producers came on was to make it seem like there were 2 story days happening. So we did some small restructuring, changed some pace things in there, and then then that comes down significantly in running time. Suddenly the section that was his pig wasn't kidnapped until I think 25, 30 minutes in these early iterations was now happening, like 15 minutes in, give or take.
So I'm trying to tiptoe around this film, and it's like there's a thing you said about it like not being like John Wick, and again, I don't think this gives away too much, but one of my initial...
I'm down to do spoilers too if you want to do spoilers.
Yeah. Maybe we'll chuck some in at the end just for those people who want to. But like, I found the third act probably has more in common with something like Ratatouille than it does with John Wick, and the kind of the way that the story progresses, and like it's. And you mentioned like obviously there being a much longer cut and scenes running longer. One scene that really stood out to me, and I think it's like perfect the way it ends, is a mirror in the mirror, and that kind of like pep talk he's giving to himself. Was that was there a lot of that? I imagine there would have probably been a lot of that scene.
There was there was a fair more amount. And what's fun about that scene is that like that's actually that contains an Alex screw up where I think he decided to reset in the middle of the take, and then we was like, wait, that seems like a mirror, like just talking to himself, and then breaking down, then talking to himself again. Yeah. That's actually Alex, I think, like getting out of character and getting back into character. But there was one of the wonderful things I think working with these two actors was how much Alex really was inspired by Nic.
Yeah.
And when it's after working on 2 Cage films and seeing Alex's footage, it's really interesting to then see Alex, almost like a protege of Cage in a sort. He's making he's making a lot of these decisions and trying things out that, Nic Cage did, 20 years ago, with these shifts in energy and bursts and momentum and rhythm changes. But, and it was really exciting and really cool to see that. So yeah, certainly there would be takes where you have a lot of variation, where he would go really big and then small, and then Michael and him would try and find it together, which was different because in most of the cases, the other 2 movies I worked with Nic, you can have a lot of Nic variation. Nic would try out different energy reads, with Richard or with Panos, and this is a movie that Nic very rarely shifted from the tone of the performance he was giving on take 1. Yeah. Like him and Michael had worked something out. They worked out a backstory for this character and worked out a cadence for this performance that very rarely shifted. And when it does, it's surprising and shocking, and it's almost like a dormant volcano. It's like this. You get like little earthquakes, but nothing on the exterior kind of changes. Maybe you get like a really intense flicker or stare. Exuding screen charisma. And then he goes from this, silent hulking type to this flash of energy in a split second. And then he's back down. He's back into his contained self, back into this super dense black hole.
Well, one of the things I found, like, especially watching them in quite close succession with Mandy and Pig, is obviously they both utilize the kind of like almost like 3-act thing of like the title cards, and like they also both center around like this kind of key scene in the middle that kind of like is like a switch in it. Do you know what I mean? Like where, and in Pig, it is that moment where him and Amir go to the restaurant, the kind of like the hot shit restaurant in the middle of Portland, and it's you get like you're saying, like you don't get anything big and brash from Cage in this, but you somewhat get this kind of like very measured and considered, like visceral takedown of this restaurateur that is just like a beautiful like centerpiece to this film. And it's kind of it's so great to, like, I don't know, speak to you, obviously having worked on something that's got this burst of anger and energy and violence, to this film that is very like like down. But again, I imagine there was probably so much more of that as well, right? Like,
honestly, not a lot. That scene in particular stayed pretty close. We ended up losing a little bit, but I mean, even from a script point of view, when my agent sent me the script and he was like, "I don't know if this thing is for you," and this is before I knew Nic wasn't even involved. I had a suspicion, like looking at the lookbook, I was like, "There's a lot of like Rob, there's a lot of Joe photos in this lookbook." I had a suspicion that they're thinking about Cage for this, but it was at that point when I was reading the script, I was like, I'm 100% in. Like it was my favorite scene in the script. It was my favorite to this day, my favorite scene in the movie, because like you said, it's that crucial midpoint of the film where um, Rob decides to rely on somebody else. Like
Yeah.
Rob decides to rely on Amir to help him at this point, and he would have not been able to go into Eurydice to the chef and talk this guy out without his help. But you also have this screen charisma, this power kind of exuding off Rob in the scene, and he's doing so much by restraint, by control, by holding things back, and the those last few lines of the scene in particular, where Rob stares down the chef and he's
Yeah.
pleading with him, but also intimidating him, but also kind of shaking him down. He's doing all these things at once, begging this guy, but also trying to strong arm him into by humiliating him in his own restaurant,
Mhm.
saying like saying more or less you're a sellout, you sold your soul, none of this matters. Hitting him with this wave of nihilism. But there's only one thing that matters. It's taken from me. Where is it?
Mhm.
This is something that matters. None of this matters. And Cage just nailed that take again and again and again and again by just the amount of restraint and control over his physical performance was extraordinary. Like
Yeah.
I think I mentioned this earlier. I've worked with a lot of actors. Nic is one of the only actors I've worked with that just feels gifted. That feels like there's something else at work that you can't train, that you can't practice. There's something else there,
Yeah.
and that scene completely showcases it.
Yeah, like have you ever gotten from an actor like a kind of like, has an actor ever reached out to you and said like, "Hey, thanks, you made me like," do you know what I mean? Like, not that they would look bad in the film anyway, but like, "Hey, you made me look really good in the edit of that," or do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
You managed to
yeah,
find.
they have. I have. Elijah's done that with my experiences with Spectre, with Cooties and stuff. Karen, Karen Gillan, who I did Parties Just Beginning with, she's been very generous about her praise. And Milana from Werewolves Within just reached out and said a lot of nice things. And Cage and I don't have a personal relationship,
Yeah.
but we definitely know of each other and very appreciative of one another. We were at an event for Color Outer Space for a Legion M or some kind of a Beyond Fest premiere or something like that
Yeah.
at this theater in Los Angeles. And they were doing a Q&A with Richard and Cage and Pat and Oswald. And this was like right in the middle of like we're editing Pig, and we're editing Pig in my apartment, which is like a 10-minute walk from the Vista. And so like Michael and one of our producers, Vanessa, come to the Color Outer Space screening with me. And then I think Patton had like mentioned Pig or mentioned something at one point, and Nic just has the microphone. He's like, "Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to my editor, Brett Bachman, who's I'm doing Pig with right now, and I think he did a bang up job on color." And there was a public screening that they were doing a live webcam on, and he totally went out of his way to do that, and that acknowledgement was extremely generous, and I hold that memory very close to my heart.
Amazing. So yeah, with Pig, there's I don't know, like one of I think the thing I find fascinating about it, and it acts almost like there's like a meta narrative to the film that
Mhm.
about Nic Cage himself, of this kind of like, especially I don't know if I'm kind of looking for this as somebody who's done a podcast looking at every Nic Cage film, but like the story of Rob is very much similar to an extent of Cage, of this thing of like, there was a period of Nic Cage's career in somewhat that he was out in the wild, that like, do you know what I mean? There was a time when the name Nic Cage meant something. Do you know what I mean? Like summer 97, it's Con Air and Face Off. And then the 2010s, it's like became that meme, that kind of guy that people, I don't know, like you get in sizzle reels, like Nic Cage loses his shit and he's somehow like a punchline to a joke. and I just find it fascinating that there's a film about a truffle hunter looking for their pig that seems like it's more of a meta conversation about Nic Cage and his career somewhat than possibly a film that is an actual meta film. Obviously, like, nobody's seen it yet, but like he's in a film coming out next year that he plays
Unbearable Weight,
himself.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like that thing of like, but yeah, like, do you kind of pick up on like maybe not that fit, but like the kind of like the themes of a film? Are you kind of finding that in the edit, or are you kind of like, yeah, is it like, do you find the film in the edit, or is it kind of a lot of them, the directors know what they want from the off?
Ooh, that's a great question. Where to start with that? Well, that's an interesting point about the meta narrative in terms of like Rob, the truffle hunter, the famous restaurateur who's now a recluse in the woods. How do you compare that with Cage's career? Can you make a comparison to Cage's career? And I'm going to kind of toss that back out to the jury. I don't know.
That's possibly my reading of it.
Yeah. I I love that kind of film analysis. On a day-to-day basis, we don't think a whole lot about that
Yeah.
in the day-to-day process of editing the movie. We certainly talk about the themes. We certainly talk about the things we want to convey with the central ideas that you want to express with the movie, because you have to be especially, you have to be a storyteller first and foremost. I mean, yes, you're selecting material, you're selecting takes, but you have to be a storyteller. And I am of the opinion that the editor has to be as gifted in story as much as the screenwriter.
Yeah.
So, for any, burgeoning editors listening, I would say, instead of reading a lot of technical books about the Avid and about types of cuts, read screenwriting books. Just read books on story, read books on character, read books on transformation and arcs. That's going to give you 9 times out of 10 more of a clear head when you reach a dilemma in the film editing process about what to include versus what not to include. So we talk about that stuff all the time.
Yeah.
On Pig, a clear example on Pig would be the scene before you were to see, the scene before he goes into the restaurant. There's a scene where he goes to a house.
Yeah.
And he goes to the house and he sits with a little boy that he meets as there. And this particular scene was on the chopping block for a little bit of time. And, the creative team, we weren't really sure what to do with it. And at the end of the day, the reason it was kept, or at least my argument for keeping the scene, was because it was one of the more foundational points of Rob's arc. And that'll make sense, once you have a full context of the movie. And, if we can get into spoilers, I can talk more about it. But you need that scene to understand why this character, what he's really up against.
Yeah.
What he's really up against. Like, you have the entire, journey into going to recover the pig in Portland is an exterior facade for what's really going on.
Yeah.
Like, yes, he wants his pig back, but like what the character needs versus what the character needs versus what the character wants are two different things. The going in for the pig is just kind of that shadow puppets. It's not what the movie's really about.
Mm-hmm.
That scene where he goes to that house and he says to that kid, that's the first genesis of him working out the conflict that really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Why the movie, hopefully, if you like it, actually has emotional resonance is because of that interior character story and that what Rob is really going through. And that is one of those scenes that, we look at from like a story theory and we're like, this is what the scene does.
Yeah.
You think like it's a 3-minute scene. Not a lot happens in the scene from like, a small point of view, but you look at that scene on like a greater structural thing on like what it represents on Rob's journey. I was arguing, I think it's extremely important because it's his first step. It's his first step to completing this arc. So we definitely talk about those kind of, thematic decisions and story through lines. But in terms of, I think leaving how to interpret a movie in terms of its, place in the world or, its meta narrative or whatever like that, I think it's impossible to predict that. We kind of leave that to the audience.
That's left up to the nerds like me.
Yeah.
Well, like, shall we get into some little bit of spoiler territory? So anyone who's listening, if you haven't seen the film, duck out now. Because there's the kind of the fight, like one of the moments that really like I think is great in this is there's a moment towards the end which will, if this were John Wick with a pig, it would be getting the guns ready, boom, 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 getting all the stuff ready, and we get this beautiful montage of Cage and Alex making dinner together, which is
Yeah.
like, and beautifully like shot, like wonderfully edited. I love like the kind of like you get the mirroring of Cage doing something, and then you get like like Alex doing
Yeah.
something like that. Like I think that's beautiful. And like again, was stuff like that, was that found within it? Because you obviously said like the original cut of this was like 3 hours long. Was a lot of
Uh,
like
but no, I mean that. I mean, we certainly you work with that material. You look for those kind of
yeah
things, and so in a way, is it made? I suppose because a lot of it's a cool shot effect. A lot of it's looking at two juxtaposing two shots that and you infer a narrative or you infer a meaning out of that.
yeah
And a lot of it's, like you said, nonverbal. So yes, it requires a lot of us in the editing to make sure that story is told when you don't have the
mhm,
dialogue doing that. All the subtext has to be in body motion and camera and sound and music. That entire end scene. From the point they agree to team up and they go to the bakery to the point where Darius tells him the truth. That's all nonverbal. Not a word is said. And all of that is body language and performance and acting and editing. Um, but no, none of that was really found in a typical sense, because the movie always knew what it was going to be.
yeah
This is a film. Sometimes you get into a film where you do a lot of restructuring. You move scenes around. Your last scene is your first scene. And I've done those kind of movies. They can be a lot of fun, and sometimes they don't work out all that well. Sometimes they turn out great. Um, this was a movie that very little changed in terms of its structure, in terms of its overall placement of scenes. Um, we changed a little bit at the beginning, yes, but this was always a film that was about friendship. It's
yeah
about loss. It's about friendship. It's not. This is. I have no idea why people are thinking this is a revenge movie. Like there is absolutely no revenge in this film at all.
yeah
Like it is. Um, like no one has like yes someone has taken his pig but like Nick isn't chasing down mobsters or people in the film world with weapons to avenge his pig. It's
well
he's trying to find the one thing that gives him happiness in the world
mhm,
because this is a story about a man that has chosen to run away from society because he was broken.
yeah
And you learn why he was broken throughout the course of the movie. And so the entire movie in the story hinges on this question of can a broken man face loss and begin to rebuild himself? And facing the loss is, yes, his pig was stolen, but he's in the woods because Lori died. He's in
yeah
the woods because his wife died. Him facing the trauma is facing the fact that his wife is dead and she's never coming back. And the pig being taken was just a catalyst for all of this.
mhm,
The true thing, him being able to kind of come back into society, being able to trust people again, and take that initial step to entrust Amir, someone that he was very reluctant to have any relationship with, forced to have a relationship at the beginning of the movie, he appreciates at the end as a true friend. And the the movie hinges on that. Like the
yeah
movie, all those elements there have to hinge on him entrusting this character that begins to see him as kind of like a role model, kind of like this mentor figure, and have this mutual appreciation for one another by the very end. Where Nick used to think he was some kind of spoiled rich kid, and then he discovers why he is the way he is, and
yeah
then Amir, begins to appreciate why this weird guy was out in the woods when he learns about Lori and he learns about his past and what he chose to run away from because he was so hurt. Like that is why the movie has power, in my opinion. Is these and that was always in the script. I mean,
yeah
Michael and Vanessa really wrote a really beautiful, really touching movie that is, I think, going to surprise a lot of people,
mhm, yeah
um, because it couldn't be farther from Bacon or, or all that stuff. And as much as I'm relishing in like people like discovering this, I can't wait for a point, hopefully in a few years down the line, where all those comparisons are completely forgotten.
oh yeah definitely. And well, I've kind of like figured it out whilst like especially look at the films you've edited of Cage's. You've somewhat like been involved in a Nic Cage trilogy of like Man of the Woods Cage, where it's
Oh my
like,
God. Yeah.
Mandy's like kind of living out there in the middle of nowhere. You've got Color Out of Space. Obviously, the Gardner family live out in the middle of this woods, and then Pig. Like it's a great little trilogy to be a part of, right?
Oh my God, someone might write a paper about it one day. I guess you're right. Yeah. I mean, my fiance and I, she was joking the other day about how much you could actually like make a comparison between Mandy and Pig in terms of just like on paper, like the loose archetypes that you find in that movie. Loner man out in woods, living with, something that he's affectionate with. And then they're both a recluse from society. And then one day, said object is taken away from him.
Yeah.
And so he makes the begrudging decision to go back and re-engage with his old identity about who he was. Yeah. Okay. I can see it.
Yeah. Well, and they're both explorations of grief as well.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the key at the heart of all of it. Yeah, like obviously people who are listening, like if you're in the US and you've listened this far, go out and see Pig. Like it's fantastic. I could talk about it all day, but yeah, I'm cautious of taking up your time, Brett. Thank you so much for coming and getting caged in with me. It's been an absolute blast. There's so many other things I had down on my notes. I'd love to talk to you, but like we'd end up talking for hours, and that's no fun for anyone.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And there we have it, guys. That was my conversation with Brett Bachman, all about Mandy, Color Out of Space, and Pig. It was a great conversation, right? There was some amazing things. As I said in the intro, there's some things I'd never heard about. I never knew there was more Johan Johansson music for Mandy. Let's hope that one day we get to see, or that gets to see the light of day. I'm sure if you're like me, you would love to hear it. As I mentioned in the intro as well, other episodes to check out if you enjoyed this one, if you're new to the podcast. I'd really recommend that one with Daniel Noah. I'd really recommend the conversation with Brian Taylor, director of Mum and Dad and Ghost Rider, Spirit of Vengeance, as well as my interview with Ken Sanzel. You really get to see how lovely Cage is, as well as Todd Farmer as well, the writer of Drive Angry, and Marco Kairis, Nicolas Cage's stand-in from 1994 to 2005. That's the level of guests I interview on this podcast. If you weren't already aware, this is the premium Nicolas Cage podcast. I'm gonna be arrogant and say that I'm very proud of what I'm doing here, and yeah, I can assure you there are some great people lined up to speak to in the future as well. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Acast, or wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. If you'd like to get in touch, please do so on all these social medias. So that is Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd, all at Caged In Pod. Or you can always drop me an email at cagedinpod@gmail.com. So as always, I have been Petrus Patsilivus. I have been Caged In. Until next time, keep it cagey, and I'll see you then.